Everyone, I've been meaning to make this video for quite some time, and I'm finally getting around to it. Hopefully it will be as I anticipated it would look like, but this is a top 5 listing of mistakes that I've made, and I'm sure many photographers have made. As a freelance or photographer, professional photographer, semi-pro photographer, whatever term you want to use. I think first I'd like to do just kind of a little bit of a background. I have read online that if you have a very small following, no one cares what your background is or what's going on in your life, but they're here for the content. But so I'll just really quickly let people know that I've recently immigrated to Canada, and I'm here on a work permit, but waiting for my permanent residency. And so I can't work as a professional photographer because my work permit is for another profession, my normal main profession. I do photography primarily on the side as a side business, but I can't do it now until I get my permanent residency. So some of you may have run into that, I don't know, but that's where I'm at right now. So while I'm waiting to be able to work again as a professional photographer, I wanted to make some of these YouTube videos and kind of give you my take on the industry as I've experienced it, at least some small portion of it. But so without further ado, number 5, camera. Focus on the camera. What I see so much online, on YouTube, on many places really, is this focus on you have to have the perfect camera. And right now the trend is more towards Sony. It seems like sometimes it kind of switches back and forth between Sony and sometimes Canon, depending upon the YouTuber that you're talking about, because they seem to focus on those more, from what I've seen at least, from a video perspective. But from a photography perspective, you see all kinds, of course. Fuji, of course, Olympus, Nikon, Canon, and Sony being the top 5, I would imagine. One thing I did want to do is say that really the camera doesn't matter. This is my D850 here. This thing right here, this little manufacturer name, means nothing. No one in the business cares what you shoot on. Ask any professional semi-pro photographer if their client has ever asked them what they shoot on, and I guarantee you no one cares. No one cares that you're shooting on mirrorless. No one cares that you're shooting a DSLR. That you're behind the times if you're shooting DSLR and not mirrorless. No one cares. What they care about is the end product, right? And I feel like too many people spend all this time trying to find the perfect camera, where they spend thousands of dollars on something that that really they don't need. And I think the focus, at least from a camera perspective, should be on what you're trying to do with the camera, right? So is your business, from a photography perspective, are you going to focus on portraiture, right? Are you doing fashion photography? Or are you doing corporate headshots, which I have done a fair amount? Are you doing landscape photography from an artistic perspective? Are you trying to sell that online, right? That's really what should drive your camera purchase decision, not that label on the camera, right? It's just a tool, folks. It really is just a tool. So if it has superior eye autofocus and you need that, that's great. But if you're a landscape photographer, you don't care that Sony has the best eye autofocus. I'm sorry, you don't. If you're a portrait photographer, you're looking for high resolution in some instances if you're doing fashion photography, but if you're doing wedding photography, you don't care that the sensor shoots 45 megapixels. In fact, you're going to dial that down if you're using that camera to something around 20 megapixels, because you don't need all that that resolution when you're doing wedding photography. You're running and gunning, right? So I think the focus, at least from my perspective, and I think from a lot of people that have earned money as a photographer, let's say, should be on what the usage is for your camera. Okay, so I just want to really focus on that. I want people to take what a lot of these YouTubers say with a grain of salt and say, when they're doing all these camera reviews, no one cares that eye autofocus is phenomenal, unless you need it. You know, I've seen a couple of videos where someone said that they couldn't use the Nikon Z6 in backlight situations because it just was inconsistent, the eye autofocus. And I'm like, but it's just a tool. It's just the eye autofocus piece of it is just it's an attribute of the camera. It's one thing that it does, right? I mean, does it do everything else well? Is the image resolution great? It's so many other things that are more important than one little feature on the camera, unless that's if you utilize that, you know, to the umpteenth degree, fantastic, good for you. But really, the tool is what should drive it, and not just the type of camera or the specs that it has, but also how does it feel in the hand? Is it easy to use? Are the menus easy to use? Your workflow means something as a professional, semi-pro type photographer. You don't want to be spending hours and hours, you know, trying to understand the menu function, or if you're holding the camera all day long in a wedding and it's balanced oddly, you know, if it's a little tiny body, and this is the thing that I have an issue with the Sonys until I guess the A7R4 just recently came out, was that the bodies are so, it's like holding a baby camera to me. Now I think that they've gotten better apparently, but when I held the A7 III, I couldn't, it was awful to me. I just didn't like the form factor in my hands. Now, other people may feel differently. So, you know, if you've got that tiny little body and you're holding this massive lens on the front, it's just, to me, it's weighted poorly. So anyway, so that's all I wanted to say on the number 5. And now these are not in any particular order, but camera was the one I wanted to focus on first because that's what you see all over the place on YouTube. And I think it's really not where the focus should be. So on to number 4, and this is, well, it's kind of an interesting one, I think, but a focus on weight of your equipment. And I don't think I brought out, no, I didn't bring it out, but when you're traveling or if you're shooting on location, which a lot of people do for their business, if you're doing corporate headshots, you're having to travel to the corporate location, and you're having to carry all this equipment, right? A focus on weight is important. Obviously not nearly as important as other things, other factors, but I think that's something that people should definitely take into consideration when they're buying their equipment. Now, one thing I just said before, of course, the Sony body itself, the mirrorless cameras, the A7 range, A7 III, A7R III, A7R4, whatever, tend to be lighter. So that is the advantage to having a mirrorless camera, but from a weight perspective. But you also have to take into consideration the weight of the lens. You know, I've got this, I'm going to toss in some B-roll on the lenses, right? But this is my 70-200 here. I'm not sure if it's in focus or not, who knows. But this sucker weighs a ton, and I don't take it hardly anywhere that I do on location type shoots, right? Because of the fact that I just don't want to have to deal with the weight. If you're shooting for hours, this thing will wear you out. Now, if you're shooting, if you have a very specific need, and you're only going to be hand holding it for 30 minutes or whatever, then the weight doesn't really matter, right? But if you're shooting for hours and hours or all day long, you know, something that's a prime like this, like my 85, which is on my camera 95% of the time probably, that's pretty lightweight, right? So I think that's probably a more critical factor, is how you're going to use it again, right? So that's all I'll say on weight. Obviously, it's pretty obvious, but that kind of flows into other aspects of your business, and that's number 3 on my list. Is not just, I have lighting written down here on my list, but both lighting and glass, right? So the glass, by glass I mean your lenses, are the most critical factor in your photography, in my opinion, right? So you can get the best camera in the world that shoots, you know, 50 megapixel, 100 megapixel resolution, right? Some medium format sensor, let's just say. But if you put a crappy piece of glass on the front of it, it's still going to produce an awful image, right? So now you may get a lot of resolution in that awful image, but because the sensor captured a lot of detail, but the quality of the lens is really a huge factor, right? So that's why I was saying when I use my 85. That's an 85 1.4 prime. It's a fantastic lens, but it has its limitations as well, obviously. So when you're picking out your gear, when you're trying to build a business as a freelance photographer, these types of things matter, and lighting also matters. One of the mistakes that I made personally was spending entirely too much money on lighting. So I thought that in order to come across as a professional photographer, I needed to have something like the best lighting, right? So I go out and I bought 2 Profoto B1s online, on eBay or whatever. Obviously, they're a little cheaper than buying them brand new, so at least I did that. That was better. But those things are freaking heavy. They're great because you don't have to carry around a separate battery pack. They have a battery that's essentially built in. I say built in, it's an add-on, right? Just like anything else. It's a rechargeable battery, and so they were revolutionary for their time, but now the new Profoto B10s have come out, much smaller, much lighter weight, and one of these days I'll eventually switch over from my B1s to the B10s probably, but there's other fantastic manufacturers that you don't have to spend that much money on, and I think if you're a photographer that would like to create a business, start a side business, or go full time as a photographer, spending all that money up front on lighting is not necessary. In many scenarios that I've run into, a great example recently even was last year before I moved to Canada. Was I did a corporate headshot shoot over 3 different sessions, and shot 120 something people in that corporate headshot shoot. But I'm out there with my massive umbrella, with my B1s, my Profotos. Now they work flawlessly. So if you need lighting that works flawlessly, then that's important, right? But if you're doing, like, let's say senior portraits or family portraits or something like that, and you miss a single, the flash doesn't go off in a single scenario, right? It's not going to break the bank. Nothing's going to happen as a result of that. That's not a scenario like you would run into with wedding photography, where you would never get that particular situation back, right? You'll never be able to recreate that. So if your lighting, your camera, all your equipment doesn't work in a wedding photography situation, that's critical, right? But in most other instances, if it doesn't fire in a single instance, it's really not that big a deal, right? But so there's Godox. I know that there's other. Aperture, of course, does a lot of lighting for, I think, constant lighting for video, but I think they're pretty high too from what I've seen. Lots of other, I guess the Alien Bees, some people use those. I'm trying to think what else, but off the top of my head. But don't go for the highest cost lighting that you can, because it's really not necessary. Most of the lighting all looks the same. I mean, when it really comes down to it, speed lights work fine. I started with speed lights, and one of the reasons I moved to Profoto from a lighting perspective was simply because it was such a pain to try to set up the transmitters inside the umbrellas. You're climbing up in there, and the connection seemed like to me between the receiver and the transmitter was inconsistent on my speed lights, and so I just got sick of dealing with them. But they were super lightweight. You could travel with those suckers no problem. So again, focus on the glass, focus on the lighting, get the lens that is applicable to your situation. Like if you're shooting bugs, if you're shooting macro photography, don't buy a 70 to 200. This thing is really not gonna get you what you need, in my opinion. Get a macro lens, right? And that's all you really need. I'm gonna toss some B-roll in here as well, and that's another thing I wanted to mention, by the way. A lot of things that you see online, on YouTube or whatever, seem to indicate that you can just simply switch from, say, Sony to Canon or whatever else at the drop of a hat, right? That it's just that easy because it's super cheap, right? You can just, you buy something and it's not a good fit for you, just trade it into KEH or Adorama or B&H or something like that, and then you're just gonna get your money back. But that's not really the way it works. What ends up happening is you lose a lot of money just in that short period of time maybe that you own that equipment. So you really want to spend the time to make sure that what you're buying from a camera, from a lens, from a lighting perspective fits the scenario or the business type that you are, right? So like again, if you're a portrait photographer, make sure your lighting is solid for sure, but don't go out and spend thousands of dollars on lighting, because an umbrella is an umbrella is an umbrella, and for the most part the lighting is really going to be about the same between manufacturers, right? Especially if you're putting a modifier on it. You know, if you're just shooting bare bulb, you're trying to go for harsh lighting, something like that, then maybe you can see some differences, right? Or maybe the flash duration is slightly different between the two manufacturers. But for the most part, you're shooting a pro photo, no one's going to go, oh, I can tell that's pro photo lighting. No, not even close, right? So that leads me to number two, and these are kind of, in my opinion, tied between number two, number one, whatever you want to call them. And I think what I've got on the list is not focusing enough on the business. And I've kind of alluded to this, but you know, so many people, they seem to think that they have to get the most expensive equipment and all these types of things, and they spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that they have a difficult time recouping because they're not focused enough on the business aspects of photography, right? So yes, learn your camera, learn every aspect of the camera. You know, what do all the buttons do, right? Before you can become a really good photographer, you need to understand your equipment, right? And I think that's part of the business aspect of it. But one thing I will mention, some things that I have done and made the mistake of, is not focusing enough on contracts, right? So in several situations I have not had a contract, and it's come back to bite me in the butt because we didn't have an understanding of what the client really wanted. One example was I had found this contract, or I say contract, this piece of business, let's say, through a freelancing website, Upwork, in fact. And I took this business because I needed to try to get my foot in the door. That's the only reason I did it. But it was about a 3.5 hour drive to the location, and then it was an hour shoot while I was there, and then it was hours and hours of editing after the fact. And I just simply did not charge enough to really even recoup my costs, right? So I think I charged $150, $200 or something for that. So we're talking 3.5 hours in the car, an hour shoot, and then probably, I want to say 5 or 6 hours of post-processing, I would imagine, at this small little boutique shop that they do cosmetic type stuff for women. And so I don't think I even broke even on that job. I pretty much lost money on the deal, and ended up losing the business later because we didn't have a clear understanding of exactly what the client was wanting. And so something just to keep in mind, a contract is so important, so critical to defining exactly what you and your client are looking for. So there's no question as to what the deliverables are, what type of images you're going to deliver, or you can deliver a photo book or any of those types of things, right? So that's all spelled out in the contract. All the pricing spelled out in the contract. You have a deposit typically, and so the client has kind of a skin in the game, if you will. So they can't simply say, "Oh, you know, last minute, I'm going to go ahead and cancel." No, because you have a non-refundable deposit that you've specified in the contract that you need in order to allocate that date from a business perspective. So contracts are huge, and something that I hope everyone out there is using. If you are in a business, I've made the mistake of not using them. So that's the only reason I'm bringing that up. And I kind of alluded to this also, understanding your client's needs. What are they looking for? What type of images do they want? Do you need to shoot something with a greater depth of field, or is it a shallow depth of field from an artistic perspective, what they're really looking for? Those types of things need to be spelled out. You know, have them look at images that you've shot before and say, what do you like and what do you not like? And to get an understanding of what the client really wants. Because at the end of the day, it's a business, and you're shooting for what they want. You know, again, I'll use that corporate headshot shoot that I did, 120 something people. I had about a minute or two with each person, each employee, maybe more than that, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. But they wanted a shallow depth of field. They wanted out in the field itself, or out in the trees, kind of a forest type background with a, nice bokeh and that type of thing. And so since we spelled all that out up front, they were very happy with the images, at least from what I can tell. And so that was a successful deal, and probably one of the best business deals I've had so far. But I've also made so many mistakes. It's unreal. Lost money on deals, just not done well on pricing. And pricing is another thing I've got on my list. Not a great enough focus on your value, your time. I see way too many people, too many photographers, new photographers, trying to undercut the other person in the business or whatever, someone that's got tons of years of experience, let's say, so they can say, well, I'll do that deal for $50, $100, whatever else, but you're selling yourself short. And at the end of the day, no one can stay in business doing that, right? If you're charging $50 or $100 for a 1 hour, 2 hour photo shoot with post-processing included, you're losing money. I'm sorry. You got all this expensive equipment that you got to pay for, right? You got cameras, you got lenses, you got lighting, as we've talked about many times. You got tripods, you've got filters, you've got everything else that goes into the business. You need to recoup those costs. So if you have an office, you've got to pay for that office. You've got overhead, right? So all that stuff needs to get factored into your pricing. If you're charging, if your pricing is so low that that's your only way to compete, then you're doing it wrong, in my opinion. That's not the best way to compete, and you'll be out of business very, very quickly. So pricing, please sit down, figure out what it takes to make a good profit margin on an individual shoot, and don't take anything less than that, okay? Because you're selling yourself short. Now, don't get me wrong. You should sometimes take free business. It makes sense to do that, to build your portfolio, right? Or shoot with a model. If you have a gap in your portfolio and you need to pay a model because you want to shoot a certain genre that you want to focus on, by all means do that. So everything doesn't have to generate money, but at the end of the day, your portfolio is your sales card, right? And so shoot something that is going to help you sell down the road. And I saw this online, and I'm going to add a link to this. I can't remember the YouTuber's name. I'm sorry, but he said that some of you guys, and you know who you are out there shooting scantily clad women and thinking that because the woman is beautiful, that you're shooting a beautiful image. And that's not really the case. The case is that simply the woman's pretty. You shot a picture of a pretty woman, right? So the focus should be on building your business. Why are you shooting that person? Now, if you're trying to do it for artistic purposes or build up a portfolio, and I've done this, right? I've shot some really unique, like Victorian era type stuff that I love. It's super fun, right? So by all means do that. Do those meetups. That's what I do sometimes to try to build up my portfolio. So I'll choose a genre that I've never shot before and shoot that and kind of put that online or whatever, just to kind of show what I can do. And that has helped me sell work down the road, right? So they can see, yes, I can see that you understand lighting, you understand the camera, but more importantly, you have a little bit of an artistic flair, something that shows that you are unique, right? And I think that's an important aspect of the business as well. So that being said, I think the number one for me on the list is thinking you need to be perfect. And this is what so many people call analysis paralysis, right? So you'll spend hours and days and weeks and months, let's just say, thinking that you're not good enough, right? That no one's going to hire you, that you don't know or you haven't experienced every aspect of the business. You haven't, if you're trying to do product photography, you've only shot a few products, let's say, or you just don't have enough of a portfolio yet, or maybe you just got in the business and you're just trying to understand the camera's limitations and those types of things. And so those things are important, by the way. So, I've mentioned this before. Understand your camera. Know everything that it can do, or as many things that it can do, that are applicable to what you're shooting, right? So if you need to use exposure compensation, understand what it does and where you need to use it, right? But for me, I never use exposure compensation, but I know what it does. It's on my camera. I know exactly where to go if I need to utilize it. So those things are important. Don't spend too much time, don't spend years thinking that you'll never be good enough, or that that everyone else, when you look at these images, you can compare to people online on Instagram and YouTube or whatever, and you're looking at their images and you're thinking, that's not something I can do yet. You don't have to be perfect. I know plenty of photographers that are making a lot of money, and in my opinion, they're not that great. It's just that they're good business people, and that's why I think it's so critical to understand the business aspect of it, because you can be in this business and you can be a phenomenal photographer and make nothing. You see some of these photographers on Instagram that are so good, so much better than me, and they're making no money, guaranteed, right? They're getting a huge following. Okay, let's try this one more time. My battery died and didn't realize it until this last video, and I'm losing the light anyway, so it works out just fine. So kind of the last thought was that I was just basically telling Canadian immigration that I am not making any money right now with my photography because it's not on my work permit, so don't worry, I'm not making any money, but permanent residency, if it comes along here within the next couple of weeks, crossing my fingers, then all bets are off, and I hopefully will at that point be able to make some money with my photography again. But anyway, I hope everyone is having a fantastic weekend. Tomorrow is Family Day here in Canada, and I think it's President's Day there in the US, and for the rest of the world, I don't know if you're celebrating anything tomorrow, but if you are, have a great day off, and if you're not off, have a great and stress-free work week, and I will talk to you soon. All right, talk to you later. Bye.